Welcome everyone to this event co-organized by the BioCAM4 Consortium and the ACHIEVE project. We are welcoming you from BioCAM4's home institution, the Dudley Institute for Global Health Research at York University. As we begin, you will see York University's land acknowledgement on the screen. We recognize that indigenous land rights and the responsibility that accompany them are central to global efforts to address climate change and biodiversity loss. Honoring these rights reminds us that meaningful climate action must be grounded in justice, sovereignty, and respect for cultural and ecological knowledge. I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Sander Chen, joining us from Rabat University in the Netherlands, who will moderate today's panel. Sander, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. And great to see you all, a lot of friends here, colleagues. Thank you for joining from wherever you are. This is a meeting that we convened between BioCAM4, that stands for Biodiversity, Climate Action, and synergies between adaptation and mitigation, and the ACHIEVE project that kind of looks at the integrity of voluntary climate action. And these projects are very close. Like we have a lot of the same questions, and we try to strengthen each other. That is why we organized the COP event together. That is why we organize this debrief together, because we feel like we can learn a lot from each other. And we can support also each other in the future. So I think a lot of opportunities here to discuss. We originally had planned a fantastic side event in Belém. But I don't know what exactly happened, but it went up in flames. But very importantly, like you are all safe. And that's the most important, and we're very happy about that. We organized this session kind of to continue the conversation. I think that is the most important, right? Apart from the side event. So I think what really stand out to me at COP30 was the emphasis on a lot of topics that we hold dear in the ACHIEVE and the BioCAM projects. One is kind of the centrality of nature and nature positive action along or with climate action. The other thing is the continued importance of the global climate agenda and also the integrity of that agenda. The COP was also referred to as, I think, what were the nicknames of the COP? I think one is the implementation COP, right? The other was the Indigenous COP, right? So we could also, reflect a little bit more on how much implementation do we see, and how much was it an Indigenous COP? Did it empower kind of Indigenous people and local communities? So I look forward to discuss that all with you. We have a fantastic panel here. And all friends, and great to see you. I will introduce you as we go, but I note that this is not a huge meeting, so also feel free to drop questions and just enter the conversation. I think that is what we learn most from. I think let's begin, right? Laurie, you were supposed to be the lead of the side event, and thank you for all your efforts there. But I think you had all the more time to think about COP30 and what you took away from COP30, what you think the global climate action agenda has achieved or not. and how things are going. Like, are we still only talking about pledges and promises, or do you feel like we're going towards more robust, more high integrity initiatives?
Thanks, Sander, and thanks for inviting us all here. I mean, it was, I think the organization of this site event in the first place wouldn't have been possible without you and Sander and Idil really kind of bringing us all together and organizing it. So I think it's really appreciative of everything you did for this, even though the site event had some other technical issues that came across. But yeah, as you said, we're all fine. I think the moniker for this COP that I also heard was the Truth COP, actually. So some people use that term as well. Yeah. I think there's a lot of good reasons to be hopeful, but I think there's also reasons to be cautious about the progress made at especially under the Global Climate Action Agenda. I think the important thing overall about the agenda is that it brings together, much needed coordination and structure to what was really a very kind of fragmented landscape of hundreds of voluntary climate initiatives. We know this because Sandra and we've also been working with the data on this as well. So. And I think having this kind of like 6 axes and 30 objectives with kind of a shared scorecard, as also was called kind of a part of an orchestrated symphony. I think it's really important that it improves transparency, coherence, and comparability of non-state action. There was also the 5-year vision set out to continue kind of a revised action agenda. And I think it's really important that the idea was to have kind of annual reviews to track progress towards the key objectives, as well as having a broader review of the priorities after the second global stocktake, 2028. I think in several domains there was progress. So I think especially forests and nature, adaptation, resilience, on some social dimensions, perhaps health, justice, just transition issues. I think they've gained prominence under COP30. And I think the Global Climate Action Agenda kind of highlights progress and scaling of some breakthroughs on forest finance, for instance. So mechanisms like the Tropical Forests Forever facility were launched to financially reward forest conservation. So this kind of like non-state, non-national pledge mechanisms kind of really leans in onto this action agenda ecosystem. And the summit also birthed the Just Transition Work Program, so a framework for adaptation tracking with new global adaptation indicators, and a global implementation accelerator aimed at helping countries and subnational actors scale up their plans. I think the fact that non-state actors, so indigenous groups, civil society, cities, businesses, are explicitly included and encouraged, along with subnational governments as well. I think that suggests that this kind of action agenda is positive and given kind of a clear home for them, perhaps in this climate governance architecture. And some statements, I think, from the presidency of the COP30 especially, I think they argue that this kind of emissions curve is being bent downwards. I think that's an important signal here. So there's some mitigation progress taking place. But I think, even though I think the agenda has potential to convert symbolic commitments to real-world impact, I think there are some issues that could be kind of brought out as well. And I think one of the things, and this is something we can all kind of discuss, obviously, is I think that the voluntary action still seems to kind of remain adjacent to, rather than being embedded within treaty outcomes. So there's kind of there's a kind of an aim to have accountability through reporting, the risk of greenwashing or selective reporting still remains. We don't have like a fully institutionalized accountability architecture yet. So reporting is like more normalized, but there's still issues of like non-standardization across sectors. It's not always universally quantitative and not integrated into the global stocktake cycles necessarily, perhaps. Yeah. And I think the issue of like having a fossil fuel roadmap outside the formal regime could signal like a systemic weakness perhaps as well. So it seems like we're relegating phasing out of fossil fuels to more like voluntary extra regime roadmaps. So we can definitely see like still the dominance of like political economy constraints over climate science urgency, and ambition at the systemic level still seems to remain constrained by geopolitics and vested interests, I think. So I think this sentiment was kind of mirrored in the Brazilian presidency's decision to avoid disputes in the final Mutirão text by announcing new roadmaps, I think. So I think that kind of comes to that. There's a lot of other things I can probably bring up, but I don't want to take all the time. So
and we will also have a lot of opportunity to talk more about it. And it's true, like I notice like how often the word roadmap is used these days, which is really interesting. I think it also it's almost like a departure from the very kind of goal oriented, like this goal led governance type, right? Now we're moving more towards a roadmap type of governance. Thank you, Lauri, and glad to hear more of you. And I realized, Lauri, very sorry I didn't introduce you, but of course you're senior researcher at the University of Eastern Finland, and we are very, very happy to work with you in ACHIEVE as one of the lead partners as well. And thank you also, Johannes, for joining. Great to see you. I hope you had a great time at COP30 as well. And I know you have been very active, like despite our side event going up in flames, you have been active on many other fronts as well. You have been doing a lot on locally led action, and I feel like sometimes the action agenda can be almost like top down, like the orchestration can be quite top down, right? Yeah, maybe we don't need to juxtapose like the top down and the bottom up, but maybe they need each other as well, right? There might be barriers for locally adaptation action and mitigation action maybe also that need to be overcome in a more cooperative setting. So do you see like a strong kind of enabling context for local climate action as well, and local action that integrates climate and nature?
Thank you, Sander. And that's a very interesting question. Simply because the challenge of local action remains, let me say local action and local leadership on climate action remains a systemic one, simply because of the architecture of the climate change governance itself. It's a global issue, and a lot of things are driven by what Peterson just said, the global politics and all that. So for a long time, local leadership and local issues really that shape vulnerabilities have been left out in the normative policy making or climate governance, and that remains an issue even from Belém. And just to be a bit more specific, while at Belém I was trying to follow the global goal on adaptation process and the indicators, and one of the things that came out is that now we had the experts who had developed a set of indicators that were being presented at the COP to the parties. And it was really very clear that the process through which those indicators were developed were really technical. It was more a technical process, which basically, sometimes did not, account for the social systems of adaptation and vulnerability quite adequately. So what we saw is that when these indicators were subjected to the discussion, so it was a huge situation whereby a hugely technical process is meeting a political process. And that was a bit of a challenge. So the outcome of the indicators was that, yes, there was reframing of some of the indicators that were presented, but at the same time there were concerns by a number of parties, especially from developing country context, about how those framings really reflect or speak to the context, which was actually really expected. Because of the very nature of the process. But the big thing here is basically what I said at the beginning, the nature of climate governance as a global process that really has a lot of this harmonization and consensus requests. So the kinds of indicators, and this is where I see again from the Belém process in the GGA, where I see again the local voices, the local opportunities to drive change disappearing, is the aspect that most of the resulting indicators, if you look at them carefully, they are largely output-oriented indicators. While they are output-oriented indicators, we know that the issues that shape vulnerabilities actually are actually within the process. The inequalities that really shape the vulnerabilities of different social groups at the local level, which then could inform more transformative local climate action, are actually within the process that shape these conversations at the local level. So that process part of things is not properly or adequately captured in this new global governance and adaptation through the GGA. And what that means is that even through these particular indicators, we are going to continue perpetuating this top-down approach, whether it's in terms of reporting. The frameworks are going to be more top-down. The financing aspects are going to still be driven by more top-down approach. So breaking the systemic cycle of inequalities and lack of proper inclusion of even local innovation in the process becomes a major issue. Building on some of the work we've done in Kenya on a project called Locally Led Adaptation Metrics, a project where we are working with local communities, local farmers to co-create indicators. What we see, and we are producing one paper that is coming out soon, what we see is that at the local level, most of the community members are more aspiring towards enabling sort of indicators. What really can enable them to take action in terms of what they have or in terms of what they can they have experienced. And this is because for a long time they've been going through this cycle of projectization of intervention. So they are used to that cycle. And in-depth conversation shows that they need something a bit new that can empower them, that even as they engage in these projects, then they're able really to take some leadership and sustain them beyond project timelines. So this remains a major issue, because then you look at the indicators that are coming up, they are either more the outputs in terms of development, in terms of profits, and these are mainly serving some other actors, not necessarily these local people. So that remains a systemic issue that perhaps needs some more discussion. Finally, briefly, Sanda, is the fact that the structuring or the framing of most of these indicators, which now we see as a new way of governing adaptation, is still more sector driven rather than multi-sectoral interlinkage. So in this, we see a situation whereby if you're talking about climate change and health, or climate change and biodiversity, as we are doing within the BioCAM project, really there is no that really framing or passion that could help to really connect these particular agendas, both perhaps at the practical level, but we also have the convention. So it's a question of, again, replicating the same lack of coherency in some of these issues. So that again, for me, remains a major issue. And also, if you think about it from the local context, it's a major issue because at the local level, things are interlinked. In Africa, one forest would serve energy, would serve health, would serve food, and they serve biodiversity, culture. They are interlinked at that level. So that again is something that perhaps even as the process moves forward could be looked into.
Thank you so much, Johannes, and I'm sorry, by the way, I'm a very bad host today because I omitted that you're executive director of the Africa Research Impact Network, Aaron, but I forget because I know you so well. And thank you also for pointing out, like, I would say the trouble of not only the adaptation, the global goal on adaptation, but also the way we kind of view climate action and voluntary climate action in particular, and how we track the progress of climate action in a way, and maybe I'm also part of it, like there tends to be a bit of reductionism in it, like focusing on outputs, focusing on mitigation impacts, etc. And this is something we should really hold to the light. And I look forward to discussing this also more. But before we do that, I would like to move on to Angela Luc, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages at York University. Angela, as we said today, like the COP has many monikers this year, and one of them is Indigenous COP. So that creates expectations. So in your view, did the COP represent a real step forward in recognizing and empowering Indigenous peoples and local communities within the action agenda, or is it more lip service?
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. That's a really good question. And I guess the way I'll answer it is just by referencing the closing statement by the Indigenous Peoples Organization, in which they stated that even at the Indigenous COP, we are excluded. And then throughout COP30, Indigenous people highlighted the increased militarization whenever Indigenous people from around Belém held actions outside of the COP venue. And throughout COP30, Indigenous peoples inside the COP venue continued to work in solidarity with those that were outside the doors. And I think we saw this. You might have predicted it if you attended the SB in Bonn this summer. Because at the SB, it felt like the Brazilian COP presidency was trying to insert their own representatives into local communities and in the Indigenous peoples platform. There was the issue of conflating Indigenous rights and local community peoples' rights and issues. And beginning in Bonn, we were told that there was going to be this special commission for Indigenous peoples' inclusion. We were told that there was going to be special badges given to Indigenous peoples and special accommodations and Indigenous people allowed to have voice at COP, but none of that actually came to fruition. And so the only Indigenous people that could attend were those who had funding and resources already in place. And you can see that, there was more, I think it's something like a third of delegates were there to represent fossil fuel and corporate interests. There was more corporate more of our capitalist colonial oppressors there than Indigenous peoples. And early on, I was invited to some of the discussions with the Indigenous peoples organizations regarding the just transition and also the gender action plan and adaptation and mitigation. And I was on all those WhatsApp groups, and it looked like all Indigenous people were fighting for was just to have like a line in each of these different agreements to recognize Indigenous rights. And so I realized early on that it would be a waste of my time if I went and sat in on these negotiations. And then I tried to be also very active with the gender action plan and following that. And even in that, throughout COP30, there was discussions about, well, even the word gender might be too, I don't know, progressive. So we're going back, I'm a gender studies professor, so we're going back like 30, 40 years just trying to include the word sex or gender. But I was happy to see that, women of Afro descent have been included in the gender action plan. And then also that Indigenous women and girls were mentioned a few times in the gender action plan. So I thought that was a win, because at first we thought even the word gender could not be included. Never mind, the complete exclusion of gender diverse folks. There's no inclusion of LGBTQ plus people. Especially, it's especially upsetting as an Indigenous person to see those our queer and two-spirit relatives excluded, because in many of our cultures, we understand queer and gender diverse folks as having very special roles within our community, spiritually, but also in relationship to the land. And I tried to follow the statements and negotiations that Indigenous peoples were putting forward regarding just transition. But I felt that there wasn't that nuance there of understanding Indigenous people as working people. Indigenous people participate greatly in the wage economy and also in our traditional livelihoods on the land. And I feel like there isn't enough nuance put forward by Indigenous peoples. So I started following the women and gender constituency, because they seem to have a better understanding of the complex contributions that Indigenous people have to our economies. Especially because I come from Northern Alberta, which is the oil sands region, where many of our men participate in energy extraction, and Indigenous peoples are very successful in implementing renewable energy in their communities, and we still have our traditional practices on the land. So I really feel like if we're spending all of our time just to include Indigenous peoples, just the word Indigenous peoples' rights and the word gender in these negotiations, we can't even have those nuanced conversations of how complex Indigenous peoples participate within our economies. And so I spent most of my time actually participating in actions. So I went to the People's March, and it was beautiful. It felt like the Indigenous COP. Indigenous people from North America and Brazil had really great solidarity with each other. We built very strong relations. And so on the ground, it felt like the Indigenous Peoples COP, because we were working together as a collective, Indigenous people from all 7 sociocultural regions. There was a real camaraderie and care that came out at this COP. Especially because there were Indigenous peoples who didn't have enough funding, didn't have proper accommodations. Even where I was staying, I stayed with Indigenous Climate Action, and we offered some of our rooms to some of the Indigenous people that had come and had not been given proper accommodations. And so just that care on the ground was really amazing. And I'm always amazed when I attend COP at all the brilliant Indigenous folks I get to meet, who also have many of the Indigenous folks, like we invite a lot of and bring a lot of traditional knowledge keepers who have an understanding of our relationship to the land, our traditional livelihoods and our languages, and how that our livelihoods maintain biodiversity, and how we're stewards of the land wherever we are. But also those same people come to COP and they have law degrees, they're scientists, they're policy experts, they're there as Indigenous leaders representing their Indigenous nations. And so it's really a beautiful experience as an Indigenous person to be surrounded just by Indigenous brilliance. And it's so upsetting how the powers that be, i.e. our colonial nation states, don't recognize that brilliance. Yet we're cited, especially in Canada, all of our climate change policies cite Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous ecological knowledge, Indigenous sciences. Like we're cited in every Canadian climate policy document as you know, leading in climate solutions. However, we're never like fully invited to the table, and our Indigenous climate solutions are never fully implemented. And so, yeah, it felt like an Indigenous COP on the ground in Indigenous Peoples Caucus, and also in some of the actions that I participated in. But in the negotiation rooms, it did not feel like that. So, yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's a very important perspective here. It seems like, you know, we had the moniker of the Indigenous COP, right? But we also have the moniker of the COP of Truth, and it seems like on the ground it might feel like Indigenous COP, but then in the negotiation room it's kind of the truth almost, and like the truth of, you know, who actually gets a seat on the table, who actually gets to influence, exert influence. And one thing that I also notice also in the Global Climate Action Agenda, if you go to the NASCA page, it's still like, if you look at them, like they have different, they count the number of actors participating in the action agenda, and they have different types of actors. So there's businesses, there's investors, which are both private sector, by the way. They have cities, they have countries, and then they have organizations, which is a huge basket, right? Which includes everything else, the whole rest of the world, but apparently they're not important enough to be separately recognized in the climate action agenda. Anyway, but before I get going on that, thank you, Angèle. I would like to move on to my dear colleague Christina Inoue, who is Associate Professor of Environmental Governance, also at Radboud University. And I think actually you will also delve a little bit deeper, Christina, into the role of local action, also Indigenous peoples. You're Brazilian yourself, by the way, and the Global Mutirão, I don't know how to pronounce it, but anyway, that was kind of the moniker of the Global Climate Action Agenda, and it emphasizes like this community-driven action. Like we earlier said, like this action agenda kind of, on the one hand, it says like we involve all the local and non-state and subnational actors. On the other hand, it's also kind of very orchestrated, like top down. What are your observations from COP30? And what can we also learn? Like you're doing also research on especially on Amazonia. Like what can we learn from community-based and indigenous models of stewardship that could inform the action agenda?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sandra and Laurie, because Laurie organized the side event before the fire at the COP, and Sandra Victor have this follow-up. Okay, I think what Angel said is very important, because I think there were many COPs in Belém, and the summit, the People's Summit, was completely different than the COP, the official COP, as was the march. And I marched together with the MST, the landless movement. And there you could see solidarity and what Mutirão means. But not at the negotiations. The negotiations, as far as I could follow, I followed a little bit of the indigenous ministry, what the indigenous ministry in Brazil wanted. And the only thing they achieved was to have a recognition that indigenous lands could be considered mitigation, part of mitigation action for the climate regime. And for the local communities to have this distinction between local communities and indigenous peoples, that was a demand from the Brazilian traditional communities, because sometimes they feel invisible. And that was one thing they were trying in the negotiations, but was very little. But I have been following within the indigenous ministry in Brazil their initiative of empowerment of youth, indigenous youth. So, and they were for like one year more or less. They had classes, they have several things to explain what a regime is, what's climate, how the climate negotiations work, and they were able to participate. But afterwards, I was reading one of the leaders, the youth leader, and she participated, and for her was the same. There was the several COPs, and the ones that really were meaningful for her were at the ground, not at the negotiations, because at the negotiations, at least for Brazilians, the main first barrier is language. They don't speak English, and there's not. 1 year they couldn't learn English to be able to follow a negotiation in the room where everybody says so many things at once and all that. So there was one of the things that she said was she felt like a barrier, even though they were invited. They had a badge to be observers. They had this Overflow badge to be in the room, but mainly most of them, some were there. They used Google Translator or something to try to follow a little bit of the negotiations, but was not, at least to listen. So they said, the only thing they could do is to listen, not to really participate. They didn't have a voice. That was the other thing that she wrote, and other indigenous youth leaders with whom I talked, they all mentioned that, okay, they could listen, but they couldn't speak. So that's a very limited participation. But at the end, at least the minister, she was kind of happy to have at least the acknowledgement that indigenous lands are part of the mitigation strategies of countries like Brazil, for instance. As far as the Mutirão and what can be learned from the local level, I have a reflection, because the Mutirão word means like working together, but it's not only working together or cooperation, because we do have cooperation in international relations. We always learn about international relations, and that cooperation can be also at the service of self-interest. And for local communities, at least the ones I know, and when I was a youth, I can give my experience. I participated in a few mutirões for building houses in favelas in São Paulo. And that's a practice that's based firstly on solidarity and not on self-interest. So it's not all working together to get my own interests, because that's what we see in negotiations, right? You see Saudi Arabia, they're blocking all the negotiations because they don't want fossil fuels in the documents of just transition. So, and they were so strong on that. So they had to erase fossil fuels from every document because otherwise they would not accept. And the other country don't accept gender. So Paraguay and Argentina say, no gender, no. So that's a lot of self-interest. And for Mutirão, it's not that. In Mutirão, the Mutirão that I know is that the community gets together, they decide together, for instance, whose house is going to be built first in the community. And that's not based on self-interest, it's based on solidarity, it's based on need, it's based on who is the one who needs most, perhaps who is the most vulnerable in the community that needs the house. And then they will build that house first. So it's a different logic. And I think unless we learn that logic of solidarity, of making decisions on the basis of who is the most vulnerable, and not on their self-interest. That's what we learn in international relations. We learn about negotiations, at least that's what we learn. And we learn that as IR scholars, but also diplomats learn about, they are there to defend the self-interest of a nation. And if they keep that mentality, will be very hard because Mutirão is always about collective decision-making, collective work for the community and for the one who is most vulnerable, who needs first. So that was my experience in Mutirão when I was young. And that's, I remember very well because it's so strong, like the community would get together and decide whose house we are building first. And always was a decision based on need, based on solidarity, based on the vulnerability. And then the others who are participating, so I was in charge with other young people to raise money, for instance. Other group would buy material, and everybody would bring together that in one moment, and the community would work together to build the house. So that's Mutirão. So I don't know how countries will learn how to do that, but unless we learn, we are always going to be in this, in 30 years, we cannot even write the word fossil fuels in a document. So that's the state of negotiations where we are, and I think that's not a Mutirão.
Thank you, Christina. And I think what is interesting, by the way, is in a way like the action agenda is not part of the negotiations itself. It's kind of meant to be kind of this sphere beyond the negotiations, accompanying the negotiations, that might want to be that place of more solidarity. But I mean, in practice, we also see a lot of self-interest there. So but I think it's a really kind of intriguing idea. How can we insert more solidarity into the global climate action agenda, which is the place where this should be the principle, I think. But I think with that's also a great bridge to Karin. So Karin Bäckstrand, professor at the Political Science Department at Stockholm University. I say it's a great bridge because you have been following the Global Climate Action Agenda for a very long time. I think we have been following it for about the same time, which is too long, maybe. You have often kind of looked at the global agenda through the lens of legitimacy, inclusion, accountability, and increasingly, hopefully, also integrity. And I think a lot of what we discussed really links to that. That is why we also, ask you to speak as our last finalist to kind of learn from your reflections on that.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you all for your interventions. I had the pleasure of being last, learning so much from your interventions, and I will take a few minutes to reflect on exactly what the questions of legitimacy, accountability, inclusion, and representation, how that reflect, how that I hope will look the coming years for the Global Climate Action Agenda. But just first to say that my expectation was very low to this COP because of the context of polycrisis, geopolitical rivalry, looming trade wars, ongoing deadly wars, and we've seen this wave of authoritarian populism, democratic backsliding with almost 60% of the world states going authoritarian, and US withdrawal, EU's isolation, etc. So I came to Belém for the first time, not to Brazil, Belém, and I must say this before I reflect, it was a wonderful COP in terms of the hospitality of the people of Belém, and I must say I've had so many meetings with local people, also outside the COP, indigenous people, and I could really, I'm from Sweden, so we have our own, our indigenous people saw me that I met, but I saw so many parallels here. And also I should say that Sweden, which is one of the world's green pioneers, we have a very dark history of colonialism and still have a very patronizing attitude to our indigenous people. So I must say it was a wonderful experience, even if the results, as you have shown, was very meager. But I think I want to take the time to quickly reflect here. I see time is running out. We have now 10 years of non-state and sub-state climate action and following closely the global climate agenda. And we see that cities, regions, business, indigenous people, youth, civil society, they really have transformed the landscape of global climate mitigation and adaptation. But what our research and practice show is very clear. While the scale of mitigation and adaptation action has grown, the democratic foundation of action, its legitimacy, questions of inclusion that you raised, accountability and representation, they have not kept that space. We see what Angela and others pointed out to lip service and cosmetic participation. And this is worrying because it occurs at the backdrop of increased authoritarian states. We see shrinking space for civil society, for media, for researchers, and that is worrying. So, but what the science is very clear. We have shown, and I'm talking about the collectives of researchers on the action agenda, that climate governance, to be credible, must meet key democratic criteria and values. So Belém was framed as this implementation summit, but legitimacy is central for effective climate action to create buy-in among stakeholders. First, inclusion. Who is at the table? And we now have observed non-states and indigenous people who has voice but no vote. Secondly, accountability, extremely important, connected to integrity. It focuses on transparency and meaningful review of net zero commitments and pledges by states and corporate actors. And we need to avoid greenwashing. Then, all of you have talked about participation. That concerns whether indigenous people, civil society have actually influence, not only symbolic consultation. And then, of course, representation challenge. Who speaks for the indigenous people, investment, business, and NGOs? Who is missing? So I think what we've seen here is, and that has to be changed, that very well-resourced actors in the climate action agenda, they dominate, while grassroots indigenous people and local communities have fewer opportunities to lead. Second, we can see accountability is still very uneven. UNFCCC have set up an accountability and recognition framework, which is very good, but we still need a coherent, robust, standardized reporting, verification, and consequences for non-delivery and poor performance to avoid greenwashing. And third, citizen participation is still very fragmented. And when I talk about citizen, it's citizens as a scientist or as an indigenous people, we need to be more present at formal negotiation spaces. And we can see, which all of you said, that non-state actors, civil society often operate in parallel to negotiations rather than shaping the outcome. And that's what Christina's your intervention on the, sorry for pronouncing it wrong, the Mutirão framing it's very powerful because it emphasizes collective mobilization and decision making, social inclusion, and the idea that climate transition should be co-created by citizen and local communities, such as indigenous people. That is something we should bring with us the next 5 years of the climate action agenda, a very people-centered COP. So I think I'm going to finish very soon, but what I saw at COP, I was in the negotiations at the summit outside, and I agree there are multiple COPs, but there is a proposal to establish a citizen track at COP, similar to youth and finance tracks, to institutionalize citizen voices in negotiations through various mechanisms such as global citizen assemblies. So these recommendations can be fed into COP. And there were also many proposals to improve accountability standard for voluntary commitments that I saw that are very important. So I think to end here, we are looking now toward the next decade of the climate action agenda. So our task is not only to accelerate implementation, but to strengthen trust, inclusion, legitimacy, and fairness in global mitigation and adaptation. It must not, we talk so much, it must be fast, accelerated, but it must also be democratic. And I thought that Belém gave us an extraordinary opportunity to really try to practice that with the Mutirão vision. So I must say, despite the weak outcome, I felt this COP gave me some hope to hopefully next year that will though be in an authoritarian country. So that's kind of sad. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. And I realize there's not too much time left, but can I suggest something? If you have questions, to share your questions in the chat so our panelists can look at it, because there's kind of little time left for discussion. But one thing I would like to ask, and whoever from the panel feels answering, please do, is how do we take this forward? Because in some sense, the glass is half empty or half full, however you look at it. But we know what COP31 will be, with a split presidency and chair, which I don't know how it's going to work, but I also don't know what it spells for the action agenda, but it seems very difficult to me. We know the next COP will be an African COP, finally again, in Ethiopia, and then India. What should we do next, and how can we maybe also, as this community on this call, help to, keep the climate action not only alive but strengthen it, and kind of, make sure that organizations actually get disaggregated in a full recognition of all these people who matter.
I think from an Indigenous people's perspective, one thing that Elder Kenneth Deere, I think, often says is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So Indigenous people need to keep showing up, because even at this COP, my understanding with even the announcement of the demarcation of 10 Indigenous lands, that although that is a good outcome, that there's also a fear that by marking off those lands that Indigenous people lose access to other lands, and that just opens the door to more development on Indigenous lands by marking certain lands as Indigenous and then leaving the rest for resource extraction and destruction of forests and waters. So I feel like we just have to keep showing up as exhausted and broke and hungry as we are. We just need to keep showing up. I don't know what else to say. I'm interested to hear what other people have to say.
If not, oh yeah, Karin, please.
Yes, very quick. I agree with Angela. A politics of presence is very important. But I would also say to keep up, what's so important is that we keep up the work between the COPs within our countries and with our governments, because we have a climate action agenda in our countries. We see rollback and backtracking on climate goals in our countries, in, of course, very different countries. We in Sweden, for example, have a now right-wing populist anti-immigrant party really setting the agenda. So I think we have to work in our national context as lobbyists, as scientists, speaking truth to power between the COPs. And then I agree, we need to be very present at COPs. And I to quote political scientists, speaking truth to power. That's in national context in global is very important.
Thank you. Laurie?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for all your interventions as well. I think overall, I just want to say, I think the fact that kind of multilateralism survived over this political turbulence we see globally, I think that was already kind of an achievement. And I think that kind of shows that if we talk about the climate action or the action agenda specifically, I think what it really shows is we need kind of institutional durability. I think the problem is that we're really dependent on political will at the moment and current momentum. And at the moment, that's perhaps not enough. It's enough maybe to survive a single COP cycle, but not enough to have a long-lasting kind of effect. So we really need to have kind of all these kind of non-state action kind of embedded in the long-term United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change processes. So I think that's really important. So it's kind of not an add-on, but it's a delivery arm maybe to all of this. So I think that would be my point of view.
Thank you. And Christina?
Yes, I think there are two levels. We have to keep at the global level, as Laura was saying, that to help multilateralism to survive, but also to change in order to incorporate other voices and perhaps to see which kind of decision-making procedure could be redesigned in multilateralism so that we reflect the people and not only the interests. Because if you really want to have a Mutirão, and which kind of principles would frame a new kind of multilateralism that reflects this collective work for the good of the community and not for self-interest, for instance. And perhaps we should need other kinds of participation, other types of decision-making, I don't know. So this kind of more global reflection as a governance community of scholars that we are. And more, as Angela said, at the local level, my commitment would be with Indigenous students in Brazil. Even though I'm in the Netherlands, I keep mentoring, and I have, as I was talking to Angela in the chat, we have this project of empowerment for young leaders, of Indigenous leaders, and to keep their presence, we need empowerment. And for Latin America and Brazilians, for instance, we need language skills. They need, how can they be at the COPs or these international environments without learning English? That's a very basic, for instance. So this kind of more local action, it's important for climate action participation and all that. And And so that is my more local commitment, would be to empower, help keep the empowerment of indigenous youth in Brazil. And that will be, if you could help us, that would be
Thank
nice.
you, Christina. And I mean, this is a great discussion, and I wish we could continue. Maybe one thing is, I mean, the three big monikers of the COP were, you know, the Indigenous COP. I think it's very half empty. That COP, you know, on the ground, yes. In the negotiations room, not. COP of truth. Well, at least we see kind of, you know, who actually controls, vetoes, etc. And COP of implementation, maybe half full in the sense of, you know, we see that mitigation-wise there has been some gains, but we also see a lot of roadmaps, unfortunately not in the agreement, but outside of it often. So there's lots to work on. There is also like the global implementation accelerator, and nobody knows what it is, right? But we did agree to it. So I think, well, Karin said, we have to be careful with only talking about acceleration. And maybe one thing this group should do is think about like what needs to be in that global implementation accelerator as well, to not only be only blind implementation and acceleration. And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining this call, and have a very, very nice day. But this is not the end of it, because we in ACHIEVE and BioCAM will continue working on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and have a nice day.
Nice day, yes.
Bye, everybody.
So much, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.